Majority Leader, due to time constraint, how much time do you want us to spend on this order?
Even 40 minutes, Mr. Speaker, if we'll be done, it would be good enough. Maximum an hour.
Go ahead.
Because there is also the other order number 9.
Yes.
Honorable Speaker, I beg to move the Public Finance Management Bill, National Assembly Bill number 16 of 2023. Honorable Speaker, allow me first to begin by thanking the chairperson of the Public Debt and Privatization Committee, the Honorable Shuria, ably deputized by the Honorable Makali Mulu, who tabled this report of the committee yesterday, because we were able to consider this bill. They did public participation, I think, over the last 2 or so weeks, and were able to table a very good report with very good recommendations, and come up even with certain amendments that are critical to the implementation of this bill. Honorable Speaker, the principal objective of this bill, as has been enumerated in the bill, or listed in the bill, first is to amend the Public Finance Management Act of number 18 of 2012 to operationalize the public debt and borrowing with regards to the framework for monitoring the level of public debt, to align with the provisions of Article 214(2) of the Constitution, which defines public debt. And this article defines public debt to mean all financial obligations attendant to loans raised or guaranteed and securities issued or guaranteed by the national government. And Honorable Speaker, the Public Finance Management Act of 2012 does not offer this clear definition of what public debt is. And it is important, Honorable Speaker, therefore, to define public debt in such a manner that it covers all elements of our public debt, because you could define public debt as just our national government debt without considering what is guaranteed by our national government to our county governments or even to government state-owned enterprises. And therefore, a holistic definition was necessary, and that is part of the objectives of this bill. Two, Honorable Speaker, we are confronted with a situation where we, as a country, and indeed many other countries in Africa and beyond, are confronted with a heavy question of public debt and its management in the running of our economies, Honorable Speaker. And Kenya has been no exception. We have had a situation where we are almost at the brink of being unable to manage our own debt. Should we allow things to go the way they are going without us taking cognizance, one, of the global economy, what is happening in the global economy with the war in Ukraine, with the inflation around the world, both in Europe, in the US, the large devaluation of our shilling against the major currencies, especially the US dollar, which was occasioned, as I mentioned, by inflation being very high in the US. Honorable Speaker, you know they say that when the US's economy coughs, the rest of the world catches a cold. And therefore, we have been no exception. Post-COVID, Honorable Speaker, and you remember in the US, there were a lot of government freebies, money being given to the populace. To an extent, Honorable Speaker, that after the pandemic, there are people in the US who are opting not to work because the kind of welfare monies they were getting from the state was at times even better than what they were getting when they were working. And that has driven inflation very high and occasioned the Fed rate in the US to be increased in a manner that it has not happened, I think, since the Great Recession in the US. And that increment in interest rates, Honorable Speaker, is what you've seen cause the problems we have here today with our dollar, which was trading at an average of about 120 less than a year ago. Today, I think it's an average of about 132 to 140 shillings against the dollar for the Kenya shilling. And the Kenya shilling, Mr. Speaker, I must say, has tried to be quite resilient. Therefore, Honorable Speaker, considering that there are all those global effects, we must be very careful how we treat our public debt. And let me thank the committee, because one of the things that were in this bill was a provision, a clause where the National Treasury sought, if they burst the debt ceiling, to come and report to the House post facto, and that is one of the recommendations that the committee has noted and actually recommended. I was trying to get it in the report, Honorable Speaker, recommended that this should not be a post facto approval by Parliament, because we cannot abrogate our role and our mandate to oversight government, and they come to report to us, because this would be abused, just like Article 223 of the Constitution has been abused, where people spend money and come to report to us after the event. And I think I want to support what the committee has recommended, that should we go beyond the debt ceiling, the debt threshold, Honorable Speaker, and I'll speak to that because that is the second objective of this bill, that should the National Treasury go beyond the debt threshold, then they ought to come for approval from Parliament before busting that threshold. Honorable Speaker, if you allow me to speak to the second objective of this bill, which is to migrate us from the absolute figure of a debt ceiling that we have been using in terms of measuring our debt carrying capacity to a threshold which is popularly or otherwise known as a debt anchor. And the proposal for an economy like ours would be a debt anchor of about 55%, and that is what this bill is proposing, a debt anchor of 55%, plus or minus 5%. And Honorable Speaker, I also do note the committee had observed that plus or minus, that if you are in the negative of 55%, then you are still okay, you are not in the red, and therefore proposed to amend that to remove the minus and just say a threshold of 55% plus 5. Honorable Speaker, I had a discussion with the chair and proposed maybe we need to reconsider that, because the intent, I think by the National Treasury, of saying a threshold of 55% plus or minus is that we are able to signal ourselves, or the country is able to know that if you are at 50%, then you know you are only 5 percentage points to hit your threshold, and therefore be careful even as you appropriate resources and as you plan for your finance bills. You know what amount of resources you need to generate to be able to reduce on your fiscal deficit that will then feed onto the amount of money that you need to borrow. In the same breath, Honorable Speaker, if you are at 55%, you know you have hit the debt threshold that you have placed for yourselves, Honorable Speaker. And anything beyond 55%, moving to 60%, then you're in the red. Currently, Honorable Speaker, as you speak, our debt carrying capacity is sustainable, but at the risk of getting to levels that are unsustainable. And I think that is why the National Treasury and the current administration has purposed that we shall not continue to dig the hole that we are in, because we are already in a hole. We are already past the debt ceiling that we set. If we were to factor in the almost 9.4 trillion shillings that was in the 9.4 trillion shillings that is in debt today, and almost 700, I think, and 18 billion, that is a fiscal deficit that we have budgeted for in the next financial year of 2023-2024. Therefore, Honorable Speaker, if we do not do anything and we continue with the trajectory that we are in, without signals to the economy and even to Parliament itself, that if we have just an absolute figure, and we set the absolute figure of 10 trillion, I think a year ago in 2022, if I remember well, just before the 2022-2023 budget, Honorable Speaker, and it was projected that this would probably take us for another 2 years. But we're already in the red, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, the rationale for having an absolute figure, whether it is a 5 trillion shillings, and I think way back in 2014 when I joined this house and found the CPM body in the house, I think we're at a figure of 2.5 trillion. And we doubled that to 5 trillion in about 2014, 2015, if I remember well. Then we moved that, I remember in 2018, when I was chairing the budget committee, there was a proposal to increase the debt ceiling to 10 trillion shillings. The budget committee then was of a view that we either revert to the debt anchor that we are now reverting to, so where we are able to measure our debt as a ratio of our public debt in terms of ratios, or we maintain our public debt ceiling at 7.5 trillion shillings up to the year 2024, June 2024. And John Buddy, we remember he was a member of that committee. And we had a heated argument with the National Treasury then, and we actually sat in this chamber. But they did insist that they wanted at least 9 trillion shillings, which we gave them. And John Buddy will recall that 9 trillion shillings was to take us to June of 2024. We are here to get to June of 2024. Last year, they came back to us requesting that we move the ceiling up again to 10 trillion shillings. And I remember many of us opposed that move. And I remember even when I was contributing, I reminded them that 3 years ago, we asked you to move to a debt anchor, something that would be signaling when you are getting into the red. But as it were, Honorable Speaker, nobody listened to us. Today, Honorable Speaker, the National Treasury would have opted to come back to us and ask us again to raise the debt ceiling maybe to another 12 or 15 trillion shillings. But the question that we need to ask ourselves, what do these absolute figures measure? What are they a measure of? And Honorable Speaker, they are just figures. I hear CPM Buddy saying it's guesswork. I will avoid using the figure guesswork like John Buddy. But Honorable Speaker, those figures are basically meaningless. They signal nothing, they mean nothing. Today, we could allow the National Treasury to raise the ceiling to 15 trillion shillings. But a country's public debt ought to be sustainable. And the sustainability of a country's public debt, Honorable Speaker, is only measured by a government's ability to be able to meet all its current and future financial obligations. And we can only be able to do that even for companies, Honorable Speaker, and accountants like Mbadi and good economists like the Vice Chair of this committee will tell you. Even for individuals and companies, when you walk into a bank, the bank will not measure your debt carrying capacity with absolute figures. They will use your cash ratios, your liquidity ratios, and that is all we are seeking to do at the macroeconomic level, to use ratios that can signal whether you have the debt carrying capacity that is sustainable for your country, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, we would ask ourselves, what is the risk then of moving from a debt to a debt anchor away from an absolute figure? And Honorable Speaker, one is that many people other than economists and finance literate people and very literate people will be able to tell you how you measure debt in present value terms. And that becomes a problem, and that's why you will find it was even easier then to convince Parliament and the House and the country that you are better off with an absolute figure. And I remember that is what we were told in 2014, that you are better off to move away from the debt anchor to an absolute figure where you know your debt ceiling is at 5 or 9 or 10 trillion shillings, and you will know when you are hitting there. But again, Honorable Speaker, we must ask ourselves, what are we measuring with that 10 trillion shillings? If someone was to ask us today, our debt ceiling today is at 10 trillion shillings, what is it a measure of? Is it a measure of our debt carrying capacity? Is it a measure of how sustainable our debt is? And the simple answer is that that absolute figure is meaningless in terms of being able to define whether our debt is sustainable and whether the country has the capacity to carry that amount of debt. Honorable Speaker, on the debt anchor, we also can't close our eyes, Honorable Speaker. And I'll ask the debt committee and the privatization committee, ably chaired by Shuri and vice chaired by economist Dr. Makali Mulu, that you have your work cut out for you. And this house will depend on the privatization and debt committee to be able to review our debt management strategies, not once a year, not biannual, but almost on a quarterly basis, be able to engage with Treasury and be able to know how are we doing in terms of our debt. The Budget and Appropriations Committee, and I don't know if the chair is here, and the Finance Committee also have a role to play. We just passed our finance bill yesterday, Honorable Speaker, that will finance the appropriation bill that we have just passed this morning, Honorable Speaker. And it is this House and the National Treasury that will determine whether this country continues to borrow in a sustainable manner or not. And Honorable Speaker, the deficits that we budget for informs how much more debt we are loading onto our national public debt. And therefore, Honorable Speaker, even as we debated the finance bill yesterday and the day before, even the second reading, I remember many members who said that we did commit to move away from sinking deeper into the pit or the hole of public debt. And the surest way of not sinking deeper, Honorable Speaker, is one, to have a very clear liability management system. And I am glad the National Treasury, in the engagement with the committee, have indicated that they are embarking on a robust liability management program, a liability management program that will ensure that, one, there is actual and almost a fiscal consolidation that you can not only feel but touch. Because we talk about fiscal consolidation, but the fiscal consolidation is just spoken about. But we never actually get into actual fiscal consolidation to ensure, one, that we are cutting on unnecessary expenditure in government. And therefore, that's why I'm saying the Budget and Appropriations Committee has its work cut out. And so does the Debt Management Committee, or rather the Privatization and Public Debt Committee, have its work cut out to ensure that whatever deficits we have in our budget books are at a level that is manageable and sustainable. They have their work cut out, Honorable Speaker, to ensure that this liability management program that the National Treasury is talking about is actually actualized. Honorable Speaker, I'm happy when I perused through the report by the committee. You remember from way back in 2014, this country embarked on what were popularly known as the Eurobonds. And some of the problems that we are living under today are a result of those Eurobonds. And Honorable Speaker, you will see in the committee's report, there is a Eurobond of 2014 of $2 billion that is maturing next year. And these are some of the short-term commercial debts that have gotten us into the problems we are. And part of the liability management strategy the National Treasury has, and as they spelled it out to the committee, if you go through the report, you will see, and those who are able to follow the public participation exercise, even from the experts who appeared before the Public Debt Committee, we will see that besides fiscal consolidation to ensure that we continue to narrow our fiscal deficit, there was a call on proper liability management. And I'm glad, Honorable Speaker, as I said, the National Treasury is already working on this liability management program, where, for instance, that $2 billion Euro bond of 2014 that matures in June of 2024, way before it matures, they are already working on a program to ensure that they retire this Euro bond, not by going back again to the commercial market and getting other commercial loans or another Euro bond to succeed this one. Because that is the easier route, Honorable Speaker. And the only reason why governments in Africa and elsewhere have opted for commercial borrowing in Euro bonds is because they usually come without any preconditions. Honorable Speaker, from the time I joined this House in 2013 to the time I was a chairman in the Budget and Appropriations Committee, every other report of the Budget and Appropriations Committee always speaks to the twin issues of fiscal consolidation. It also speaks to our debt management strategy. But as I said, those reports are just filed away. All our recommendations seem not to be followed. There are always recommendations of moving away from commercial debt to more concessional loans that are longer term. Honorable Speaker, I am happy that the National Treasury now is deliberate and intent on moving away from these expensive commercial and short-term loans to longer-term concessional loans, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, concessional loans, okay. Forgive me, Honorable Speaker, it's where I come from. I was about to say concessional loans. Concessional loans, Honorable Speaker, either bilateral or multilateral loans, are loans that we will enjoy cheaper interest rates. And I think the most expensive of these that we are getting today, I think about 2.5%, I think from the China Exim Bank, which go for a period of about 30 to 40 years, as opposed to these Eurobonds that are 10 years. The one that we are retiring today, Makali Mulu will tell you, we got it at 6.8% in 2014. But because of the risks, our risk profile, the spread of this Eurobond, sometime last year, around elections time, I was seeing it had a spread of about 14 to 18%. The highest at one point being at 21%. Meaning if that Eurobond was to be called up, would pay interest rates of up to 21%. But today, Honorable Speaker, because again, post-elections and with the stabilization of the economy, that spread has come down to a current rate of about 12%. But still 12% is too high for a country like Kenya, a middle-income country and a growing economy like ours. 6.8 is still high, and that is why the National Treasury is saying we look at more concessional loans, which would, the most expensive, be about 2.5%, but there are loans that you get even at 1%, 1.5%, 2%. And Honorable Speaker, I've heard the President speak also to that question of even those concessional, multilateral and bilateral loans, because African countries are also getting those loans very expensive. What African countries are getting at 2.5, 1.5%, you find other economies in the world, especially in the West, getting at 0.1%, like in the US. Others in Europe will get at 0.5 to 0.1, 0 point when we are getting at almost 2 and above 1%, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, let me not belabor the issue of liability management because I can see the committee has spoken into it in detail. I've also spoken about the fiscal consolidation, which, as I said, we have a duty and a responsibility as a House. And I'm happy that what the committee is recommending in part of the recommendations they have proposed to bring during our third reading will touch on some of the issues that a number of people, even during public participation, were not very happy about. I remember the Institute of Social Accountability did present on the particular clause that sought to take over the work of Parliament in our constitutional mandate to oversight the national government and the National Treasury, and that the committee has agreed with people who came through public participation and the concerns even of many of us who felt that we cannot relinquish our responsibility as Parliament to other people who are not elected by the people of Kenya to oversight. Honorable Speaker, let me end it there and request the Honorable Makali Mulu, who is the Vice Chair of this Public Debt Committee and who indeed put in a lot of work and long hours. I remember seeing them working even over our weekend to be able to put together this report for tabling and adoption by the House, and urge the House to support this bill. It will go a long way to helping our country to be able to measure our debt and our debt carrying capacity and be able to know how sustainable our debt is. Just like as individuals, as corporates, for those of us who have managed corporate companies, we are able to get signals of whether we are moving towards the red. And that is all that this bill seeks to do, to alert us and alert the country when we are moving towards the red in terms of our debt carrying capacity and how sustainable our debt is, Honorable Speaker. And with those very many remarks, allow me to ask, I beg to move and ask the Vice Chair, Dr. Makali Mulu, to second. Thank you, Honorable Speaker.
Makali Mulu, Honorable.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Honorable Speaker. Honorable Speaker, I want to start by thanking the majority leader for that